Do you know how it feels when you ignore how great a game is, but then appreciate it long after anyone else has stopped caring about it? I wouldn't publicly call myself a Grand Theft Auto fan because I'm not 14 anymore, but this series has been with me for most of my life, and it's one I have more often than not found enjoyment in, especially back when these concepts were new and not done to death. But even now that its genre of open world 3D games where you commit Grand Theft Auto and other non-titular crimes is so passé, there is still a charm to some of the older titles. They all offer something that I respect, so here is a quick rundown. Grand Theft Auto 1 was the first. Grand Theft Auto 2 was the first good one. Grand Theft Auto 3 was the first 3D one. Grand Theft Auto Vice City was the first one I played. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was the first to add a bunch of features that are now standard. Grand Theft Auto Advance was the first original portable entry. Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories was the first 3D portable entry. Vice City Stories was the first really good portable entry and a personal favourite of mine. And Grand Theft Auto 4 was the first HD one. Then came Chinatown Wars, which has a lot of firsts I'll get to shortly. Its release is sandwiched right between the also great GTA 4 expansions that are often ignored despite both of them being much better than the regular Grand Theft Auto 4. And then we have 5, which is still going and probably will never stop going. These games usually take place in Liberty City, San Andreas, or sometimes Vice City, with the first two being recent enough that they're actually remembered by the target audience of these games being teenagers with fake IDs or parents that just don't care. These games are often touted for having amazing worlds that cause mayhem in, especially in the PlayStation 2 era, where titles like this had less direct competition. And while I love driving around Vice City or either of the depictions of the San Andreas area, Liberty City has never been a personal favourite of mine, despite it being the public's introduction to this series in 3D, portable 3D, and HD. GTA 3 is my least favourite of the PlayStation 2 games. Liberty City Stories is my least favourite of the two Stories games, and GTA 4 is my least favourite of the HD titles. I enjoy all the games, but they've just never really done it for me in the way that the other releases have. Perhaps it's because this is usually our introduction to the games on a new system, and later titles improve the formula and let us see the original game's flaws, or because Liberty City is basically nothing but grey buildings and it wears on me, or because back when Grand Theft Auto gave us games across different time periods, Liberty City gave us more current feeling settings. With the Liberty City games, they had a bit less identity to them. It could be for a lot of reasons, but the point is, GTA 3, Liberty City Stories, and GTA 4 are at the bottom of my modern GTA tier list, but there was one game absent from that discussion even if it shares a lot of that same identity, and that's because Chinatown Wars is not a middling entry. It is genuinely one of my favourites. This 2009 entry is the handheld counterpart to Grand Theft Auto 4, much like how the PSP titles I mentioned earlier were the counterparts to console games, and then eventually became console games. Just don't think about it. The setting is unmistakable as the same Liberty City from Grand Theft Auto 4, though we are missing one of the 3 landmasses, but I don't really mind. More isn't necessarily better, especially in the grey mess of Liberty City, where there aren't enough landmarks to anchor myself. Set in 2009, we play as Huang, a young adult from Hong Kong, and is the son of a now deceased triad leader. He flies to Liberty City to deliver his late father's sword to his uncle, and then antics happen which see us trying to uncover his father's murderer, helping a lot of potential triad leaders who all have a laundry list of tasks, and also uncovering a potential snitch. The story may not sound like a lot, and it isn't, but that's part of this game's charm. We have a smaller focus and less characters, which means characters don't run out their usefulness as they did before. A lot of Grand Theft Auto games start with us helping lower level criminals and we work our way up the ladder. Here we are working our way up the ladder in the sense that we're being given more difficult and important tasks, but they're still with the same faces. We aren't a nobody, we're family to someone who already made their impact and are given the head start others just can't get. We don't have to spend the middle of the game with middle management, we spend the whole game with the types of people we would expect. For the most part, the faces you see at the beginning will still be important at or near the end of the story, but there is still escalation as new faces are added later throughout that story. And while the map itself isn't locked off to you, There will still be a wider variety of locations to do missions in, as we ease ourselves away from the very local affairs of where we start the game. But even with all that said, this isn't your typical Grand Theft Auto game. Chinatown Wars was made with a Nintendo DS in mind, and while it's no longer exclusive to that system, the DS still branded its presence here. The game is top-down, which is easier to do, although it wouldn't have been impossible to do a more modern 3D style GTA. That said, this title does benefit from this approach, as it finally throws a bone to the neglected classic GTA fans who missed the original entries. And in an era of Mega Man 9, it wasn't out of place to see retro-style games get the spotlight again. It was inevitable. However, this does aim a bit higher than other nostalgic titles, as this game does a lot of things that couldn't have been done on older hardware, and more importantly, it has its own identity unique from any other entry. Chinatown Wars loves the DS touchscreen and puts it to some fantastic, albeit gimmicky uses. There are minigames here such as hot wiring cars, which require us to touch on the bottom screen or even touch the screen with the eventual mobile release. They work well on either system, but what if you want to play a touchscreen reliant game without a touchscreen? Well, you can join me in the PSP corner here. All the touchscreen functionality has been ripped out of the PSP release for obvious reasons, but this is still the version I chose to play. I like oddities and it spoke to me, although not literally because this game is still very quiet due to the lack of voice acting. This game is weird in the fact that it strips out most of what the game was built for, but it is also in some ways the definitive release. Although every release does actually have something to offer, and I wouldn't say there is a best version of this game to play. Chinatown Wars was impressive for the DS, but not at all on the PSP, especially given the fact that this is the final game in the PSP's GTA trilogy, with the first two looking like PSP titles. But instead of being held back by the hardware limitations, this is a nostalgic throwback through and through just for the sake of it. But the obvious reason is that the DS's target audience didn't buy Chinatown Wars in droves, and while the PSP wasn't a great seller, it had an established audience for the franchise. This is a relatively low effort conversion, but it does still work on its own. The graphics have been improved, both in and out of mission briefings. We have more music to work with, and there are even a few more missions here. And the game is crammed onto a single screen, which can make it easier to play, but this does have its drawbacks as well. For those who don't like the constant switching of the stylus and regular button presses, this is a more traditionally controlling experience, and it is good at that. But it didn't quite stick the landing, as there are still the minigames like hot wiring which do feel kind of out of place. On the bright side, they don't intrude too much and still does lead to this game having some uniqueness. Chinatown Wars isn't the first portable GTA, but it is the first that really feels like a portable one. Liberty City and Vice City stories were portable and they still felt like traditional GTA games with the same mission structure and objectives. I enjoyed them, they were good especially for the time. It was GTA but on the go, and that's a real difference. However, Chinatown Wars isn't just GTA but on the go. It's a game built for smaller bursts, it's very pick up and play. You could be on the bus and complete a mission before you get to your destination, or do a quick mission on your break from work. This is the working person's game. You play Vice City stories on the go and you'll be in the middle of a mission when you get to your bus stop, or you'll play it on your break and then your boss will yell at you because you're meant to get back to work 20 minutes ago. That isn't a criticism of the earlier titles, I do really like them, but Chinatown Wars knows what it is and it's making concessions to better fit the reality of most players. This is an outdoors GTA, whereas earlier ones were the I'm still at home but my brother is using the PlayStation so I'll just play my PSP on the couch instead. Or in my case it was the I'm playing games in bed after midnight and I have school in a few hours but my parents still think I'm sleeping type of game. Yeah, that probably explains my report cards. The missions aren't just shorter, but they're so much more varied than ever before, and this is what really kept me attached. Grand Theft Auto has had a pretty standard formula since 3. You drive, you shoot, and sometimes you drive and shoot. There are other objectives too, like racing missions, but for the most part what you're doing is the same thing from the beginning of the game till the end of the game. Only the scope and challenge increases. This was made worse in GTA 4, which was the newest entry at the time, which had more of a focus on cover-based shooting, which meant missions kind of bled into each other and didn't stand out as much as they could have. Instead, we have driving and shooting as you'd expect, but not only are they spliced with other gimmicks I'll get to soon, they are joined alongside missions that are frankly out of place for the series and I love them. Some examples include a racing mission but with the twist that we're not actually racing, we're just trying to stop other cars from winning so a particular car can win. Or the bank robbery mission where instead of doing that and a getaway, we dress up as a traditional Chinese dragon and perform in the Chinese New Year festival so the police don't recognize us. These are just a few examples, but the game is all too happy to give us something new to do, even if it does feel out of place. And this is further shown with the PSP exclusive missions, which stand out of their way and give us interiors of buildings to play in, and we do such things as using a bat to knock down some beams of wood so we can actually get through a hole in the wall. Little things like that give each mission more identity and they still stick with me long after beating the game. The PSP content isn't just unique in the sense that we get to play inside buildings, which the vanilla game does not really do, it also gives us a female mission giver. Okay, Chinatown Wars isn't winning awards for representation. There are basically 2 women in the entire game, and one is only in the first few missions, and the other is exclusive to the PSP. And while I'm talking about representation, let's just say this series isn't a stranger to slurs and insulting minorities, and this game is no exception to that. I'm sure that won't bother most of the target audience now, and it bothered even less of them back in this game's 2009 launch. These things did hurt my enjoyment of the game at times, it does make it a little harder to recommend, but every time I feel my enjoyment is dissipating, I get reeled back in. This is a more arcadey game and it doesn't like to waste your time. Cops can be dealt with by ramming into their cars to the point they're totaled, which means we can get out of police chases more easily, and it's a more fun mechanic than just going to a pay and spray or just hiding. Whenever we fail a mission, we can instantly restart and even skip the drive to the destination. If we need to buy missions, we just do it online from the pause screen and then it's delivered straight to our safe house. This game knows what you want and it won't give you dull moments of padding. And the overall combat is more arcadey as we're top-down shooting without little things like cover getting in our way. Just wish it was a twin-stick game, but as it stands this still works quite well. And our thrown weapons like molotovs and grenades are more useful here than in any other Grand Theft Auto title. They are hotkeyed at all times, meaning we're incentivized to use them, so we're basically dual wielding a gun and grenade constantly. There isn't even awkward weapon switching in general, as we pretty much have a radial menu for it, which would have been a first for the series. At the time of its release, GTA wanted you to cycle through weapons one by one, and the arcade feeling is exacerbated even further, as we get the ability to replay missions and they even have a timer included so we can best our own high scores. This game is a gem for so many reasons, even if people just think of it as a drug dealing simulator. Oh yeah, there's drug dealing as well. You can buy drugs, you sell drugs. It's basically trading stocks, you buy low and sell high, except the police will seize what you have and they will attempt to arrest you after some trades. It is a fun mechanic, I enjoy it, and it does help make this game feel like its own, but it didn't really stick with me. Perhaps if I played this game at launch and this was a game I played repeatedly for months on end, I'd find much more use out of this. But in today's busy age where I have a gaming backlog that is consuming me, and full-time work burying the remains, I just don't have time for this mechanic. If you want easy money to spend an hour scratching lotto tickets, you'll walk out several $1,000s richer and maybe even own a new home. Chinatown Wars is a great game and it does a lot right, and more importantly, it is perhaps the most unique entry in the series. There is nothing else quite like it. Even the other top-down games like GTA 2 or Advanced just don't have this game's energy or variety, and they certainly don't have the constant interruptions for minigames designed for the touchscreen. Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars is still, at the end of the day, another GTA game, with all the crime committing and slurs for the target audience of 15-year-olds. But even with that, we have a game that is just fun and full of great design. This isn't my favorite Rockstar game, that's Bully, or my favorite GTA, that's San Andreas. But this is still my favorite GTA designed originally for handhelds, and my favorite GTA set in Liberty City. It is fun, it is short, and it's highly replayable. This is a great title, be it on DS, PSP, or mobile.